Hello, and welcome to an engaging episode of Stan the History Man. And I'm your host, Dr. Stanley Sandler. And today I want to talk about our first car, Mrs. Sandler and my first car. And it was a 1952 Chevrolet here. Okay, 1952 Chevy. Now ours was not the fastback like that, but that's the closest I could get to our car. Is this 52 Chevy? Now we bought it in Ontario, in Canada, and it was. Let me just adjust my thing here. Yeah, and it was used when I bought it from uh, my wife's parents, and they bought it used. It was in pretty good shape, but still was an Ontario car, and that's the problem for the Ontario and all the northern states because these are rust belts up there, and it just seemed as though the designers of cars in those days didn't really care much about rust. Just the part of what you expect. One really bad thing, a bad place for that was right down here by the. Let me get that now. Everything is reversed, of course, so it makes it hard for me. Right there by the back fender. Okay, you see that piece of chrome. Well, that really collected not just rusty water. Okay, and I mean, well, salt water. And you say, well, just unbolt it and take it off and clean. You couldn't. They were rusted in solidly. So what we had to do about it, after we had it for a year, was get it undercoated with like a mixture of oil and red lead. So that kind of slowed down the rust, but it never got. That is the sort of the cancer of the North is for cars. It's rust. Well, anyway, the 52 Chev was actually considered quite they first came out this style in 1952. I'm sorry, 1949. They were really an advance over if you look at a 1948 Chevy or 1948 Ford for that matter, and 1949, big difference. So, and in those days, I don't think the cars were as good. Now, I'm a fan of old cars. Okay, I restored a Packard, a Tatra, but our car, when it got to 90,000 miles, we said, look, it's time to turn it in, 90,000. Nowadays, it'd be considered, kind of well broken in. That's about all. So, and of course, I think this is because of advances in metallurgy, lubricants, a lot of seal joints. You don't have to make sure you lubricate everything. We had to lubricate the distributor cap. Put a little fine oil into it. We had to file down the distributor arms, and that had to be done about every 500 miles. So cars required a lot of maintenance, and they didn't last as long. I would even make the assertion, and if some of you disagree, you can answer me, that the cars now are better than they were than the cars then, in the sort of sense of how long they last. The average car now is about 7 years when an American turns it in. It used to be, as I say, 3 years. And of course, Detroit wanted you to turn them in every 3 years. So they changed their styles often every third year. Now, this particular version of the Chevy was changed in 1949, and it kept basically that style until 1952. The year of my car, maybe even the 53 wasn't that much different. So that's another big. The cars were longer lasting, and by every basics, everything that counts, that they were better. I don't think they have quite the soul that the old cars had because they're all plastic now, half plastic. But and I don't know why they use that. The cars have got so much better mileage. I don't know why they're so concerned with keeping the weight down, because this 52 Chev got about 12 miles to the gallon, straight six engine, 12 miles to the gallon. Okay. Now, what about safety? A big difference there too. I won't say there was no safety, but it was pretty much hit or miss. Now, in 1935, a guy last name of Furness, Ferness, wrote an article in Reader's Digest called "And Sudden Death," and boy, it was grim. He told about what happens after a car crash. I remember him talking about the people laying on the road covered in crankcase oil, flopping about like wet cigars. I mean, the guy was a great writer. And because of that, there really was a push, not from the government so much, but public push that we're not going to buy cars that are unsafe now. Before the time, safety, schmasty, nobody cared about it. The windows were plate. I mean, can you imagine your windshield being plate glass? But they were. So that, one of the first things they did was get into safety glass. Although I almost say every silver lining has a cloud, and the cloud here was with the safety glass, you go hurtling through it, maybe badly cut up, but you'd be anyway out laying on the hood. But with safety glass, you might go just through to your neck, and the rest of the safety glass would hold you, could cause cut throat, fatal injuries. So, but still, I think it did improve in the long run. Also, sealed beam headlights. Now that was all, of course, in by my 52 Chevy. That came in the late 30s. But again, the other fly in the ointment, or according to my phrase, another the not so good thing about silver linings, the cloud of silver lining was the tops of cars before this time were made pretty much out of the top was not covered in the metal stampings, or that's something made of wood, of course. They were covered with, first of all, filled in with slats. Then the slats were covered with tar, or with canvas, and the canvas was tarred over. You ever look at pictures, like in old movies, you look at a picture of an old car, you notice the top is not shiny because it's not metal, all right? Well, that's good. When your car turns over, you've got some metal to protect you. However, these kind of stamping machines were very expensive because they could do double curves. A double curve is really hard to do. It's the Model T, for example, the hood, the fender was just bent down like that or welded. Now the Model A's, they could do the double curve, and so you look at the fender, the front of the fender, it's double curved around and to the sides. So these stamping machines were very expensive, and so only the big companies could afford them. So a lot of smaller companies like Hupmobile and Graham Page went out of business. So again, there's always this cloud to a silver lining. So much for safety. Now, electronics. What kind of electronics did we have then? We didn't have any. Later on, we had a radio installed, of course, an AM radio, and you turn it on, and you have to wait for about a minute for the vibrator to warm up. Okay, and then you could have your radio. So that was getting pretty standard now to have, but it's still optional, extra cost. Another thing that was optional was there was no way to defrog to get the water off your windshield. So we actually had installed a thing that had a rubber tube on the floor, and you press that with your foot, and that would send a shot of water to the windshields, and then you put with the window wipers, that would clear away the water. It worked pretty well, but it was certainly anything but electrical. So and then plastic. I wanted to mention plastic. There was no plastic in it except for some of the levers on the dashboard. One of the levers, for example, to control heat and the flow of air. Now, no air conditioning. I mean, you could get air conditioning. That was expensive and only standard, I believe, on the highest end of cars. Excuse me. And in fact, I read stories about, in the late 50s, early 60s, people driving around in hot weather with the car windows rolled up like we've got air conditioning. So, and matter of fact, I think Cadillac, when they came out with air conditioning, they came out before the war with it, but it really didn't sell that much. But after the war, post-war prosperity. So the Cadillacs had two scoops on the back fender, like we got air conditioning standard. Okay. So the electronic stuff we're used to just didn't have in those days. Basically, you want fresh air, you roll down the windows, or you just put some of the vents on. Fogging of your windshield, the inside fogging of it. Originally, up until maybe the 52, my car, they had a little fan, and that fan had rubber wings on it. And you turn that on. You have to reach up and turn it on, and that would blow wind onto your windshield and kind of get the fog away or the condensation. But if you're restoring a car from the before 19 a Chevy before 19, I'm not sure the exact date, 52, 53, the biggest problem you have is getting that little motor and of course the rubber wings or flies or the blades that were wrong. Where do you get blades for 1952 Chevrolet? So I don't know. I just wonder how they do it. Maybe just take it off and say, well, we never had one in the first place. So this 75 years ago, this is a long time, but it's not the dark ages. But to think how how different they are from what we have today. Of course, I always point out the past perfect, which is one of the things I'm always emphasizing. We back then didn't think, oh, these are old fashioned. They don't have this, they don't have that. They thought, wow, compared to what they had earlier, these are like the Model A is a great improvement over the Model T, and the Ford Model B was a big improvement over the Ford Model A. So I call it the past perfect. And that's the best way to understand the past, not go back and compare the past with the present. Don't compare our cars of the 1950s with our cars today. Compare the cars of the 1950s with the cars of the 1940s. However, cars they may have been made in the 40s because the war cut off production for half of the 1940s. And after the 1940s, until about 49, basically what you got, if you were able to get a car after the war, a new car, it would be a rehashed version of the of a pre-war car. I mentioned this. I bought this car when I was living in Ontario. I was teaching up there. The Canadians had a Canadian auto industry of your own. A lot of people don't really, including Canadians, don't know that. For example, McLaughlin was a fine old car absorbed by Buick. And so eventually what happened was they couldn't compete with the American giants south of the border. So they couldn't move the factories to the south of the border. I mean, the unions wouldn't allow them. So they produced them up in Canada under basically American names. Although as late as the early 50s, when we had our 52 Chev, you could tell a difference between a Canadian manufactured car and an American car by just rearrangement, very minor, of the chrome, usually the back of the chrome. So they say this is a Canadian car made by Canada made by Canadians for Canadians. So it's a little bit of that nationalism there. But now, of course, they're all the same across the border, back and forth. North America Free Trade Zone and the whole bit. But these cars, safety. I talked about the windshields and all. I should point out also that Detroit's attitude towards safety was their slogan was "Safe drive, safe arrive," or "The life you save may be drive carefully. The life you save may be your own." Well, even back then, I thought, well, okay, I'm sober as a judge, driving on speed limit and all, but here comes this guy down the wrong side of the road with, drunk or whatever, and he slams into me. What can I do about that? So I think it's really a dark mark on Detroit. They fought against safety so long. Like, our car's unsafe. Well, what are you talking about? If you drive safely, that's it. The car itself is not to blame. Well, that's what they called, after Ralph Nader's time, the second collision. You get hit and then you go flying forward or whatever. That is the second collision. That could be, I'm sure, as fateful as the first collision, the damage done by that. So I think and even with Ralph Nader, he's almost the patron saint of safety nowadays. They tried to blacken his reputation, but then he went too far. I said the safety, the car that he was denouncing, that was the rear engine, the General Motors car, says unsafe at any speed. Well, that model was, but later than that, it was a very good model. But the damage had been, the only time Detroit really said, let's try something different, a rear engine car, all that. But no, it was lost. Now, of course, they're collected by collectors. And maybe one final thing. In those days, we had the family car. Car. Dad drives to work, mom stays home, does the dishes or whatever. Nowadays, a household have 3 or 4 cars. Mom works, dad works. The elder son, he can't take, school buses suck, so he's got to drive to school. And baby sister Well, she maybe needs at least a car of her own, and they have to have a fun car, also a beach car or something like that. You're talking 4 or 5 cars now per household. And it's interesting. A number of years ago, some commentator on the American scene was looking at all the cars, and he said, if one of these, stereotypical flying saucers reconnoitered North America or Europe, for that matter, and looking at the little green men, and they're looking, and they would determine, then they report back to Mars or whatever that this planet is the dominant force of species is the automobile, what they call the automobile, because they didn't see any people. And haven't you driven to some newer suburbs where there's lots of cars, but you don't see a single person? And I said, well, you see them in the cars. They might say, well, the drivers of these cars are the parasites inside the dominant form of life. But it really, to me, it's almost appalling. You can drive for miles and not see a person, maybe in a gas station. But even then, you fill it yourself. So unless you go in for a cup of coffee or something, you won't see another person. That's good or bad. I don't know. I kind of think it's bad, but anything that does away with people. But it's again, you can say it's a big change from the cars of the 50s and all to what we have today. And the thing that impresses me is it wasn't that long ago. Well, thank you very much. Another episode of Stan Histerman comes now to its own, and thank you for listening. Bye-bye.